Coming up on Retro Bits.
Machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
All right, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
The Genesis 32X was first launched in North America in November of 1994 with an initial price of $159 US. Spearheaded by Sega of America, this add-on device was intended to be a lower-cost option designed to expand the existing console without requiring the user to purchase an all-new system. By the time of its release, the Mega Drive/Genesis was already 6 years old and was facing competition from newer, more powerful 5th-generation systems such as the Atari Jaguar and 3DO. Tragically, the 32X came to market in the US the same month that the more powerful Saturn launched in Japan. Given that the 32X was a stopgap measure and lacked Saturn compatibility, it was no surprise that it quickly turned into a commercial failure. This major marketing blunder by Sega is well documented by this point, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it. Now, I don't want to let the lack of commercial success bias my opinion, because I've never had the chance to experience the 32X before. So instead, let's move along and take a look at the technical specifications. The system is powered by a pair of Super H2 32-bit RISC processors clocked at 23 MHz. These are essentially the same as found in the Saturn, but running at a lower clock speed. A joint venture between Sega and Hitachi, the SH2 also found a home in engine control units of cars from Subaru, Mitsubishi, and Mazda. Later variants were also used in mobile phones, Windows CE devices, arcade systems, Sega's Dreamcast, and other multimedia appliances. The processor is supported by 256 kilobytes of main memory and another 256K of video RAM divided into 2 separate frame buffers, which allowed the 32X to move away from the tile-based graphics of the prior generation. The custom video display processor can render 32,768 simultaneous colors on screen compared to the 61 of the Genesis. In reality, the chip is little more than a digital-to-analog converter that takes whatever the CPUs have rendered into the frame buffers and pushes it to the screen. Genesis graphics can also be composited into the scene. While the system positioned itself as a 3D console, there's no hardware support in the VDP for scaling, rotation, or other 3D operations, which are all performed by the SH2 processors. Audio capabilities have been enhanced with stereo pulse width modulation sample playback mixed in with the Mega Drive's FM synthesis. Q-Sound positional audio was also supported, but for various reasons such as poor documentation, difficulty programming, and time constraints, most developers ignored this capability. While it was indeed much more powerful than the Genesis, every new console needs a robust catalog of software in order to be successful, and the 32X's got off to a bit of a rocky start. Rushed to market in time for the '94 holiday season, there were a number of hurdles, including delays in shipping dev kits, lack of documentation, poor support from Sega of Japan, and the complexity of the all-new dual-processor hardware. As a result, only 3 games were available at launch, and only 40 titles in total were ever released on the platform. Even more telling is that the number of cancelled games is greater than the number of those that were eventually released. Developers ended up either ignoring or abandoning the console in favor of the Saturn and PlayStation, leaving the 32X with a few hit titles, but a paltry overall library, and spelling disaster for its chances of success. Of the 40 releases, 6 utilized the combined power of the 32X and the Sega CD/Mega CD add-on, aka the Tower of Power, to deliver full motion video with 32,000 colors instead of 61. By the end of its short run, 800,000 units were produced and nearly 500,000 were sold in the first year, driven by strong initial holiday sales. These soon slowed, however, and by 1996 the console was discontinued, with remaining inventory being liquidated in stores for as little as $20 US. Earlier this year, I made a video about retro thrifting in Japan where I asked the question of whether or not there were still good deals to be had. In that episode, I discovered that most of the interesting hardware had become too expensive to be considered a deal anymore. Especially rare in Japan, I spotted this boxed 32X for what was actually a reasonable price in 2024, but lamented that the best time to buy stuff like this had passed, and I'd come to terms with the fact I'd probably never own one. After watching that video, a viewer commented that he still had his childhood system and was willing to donate it to the channel. And here it is, complete in box, just as he received it for Christmas in 1994. How awesome is that? Now, he's not looking for recognition and has chosen to remain anonymous, but we'll still need a pseudonym for our kind benefactor. So how about Steve? I guess that'll work. So thank you very much, Steve, you know who you are, for this incredibly generous donation. All right, let's have a look at the Sega Genesis 32X, the 32-bit arcade upgrade for Genesis and Sega CD. It has 32X power and performance, 40 times faster than 16-bit. That is really ambiguous, doesn't really mean anything. And it has a full library of new 32-bit 32X games. Well, we know it launched with only 3 titles, so that is a little optimistic, if I do say so myself. Right here we have the price tag from Affy's. I'm not familiar with them. The price was $149 US and the date code was November of 1994. So this is a Holiday 94 Launch Edition version. Very cool. On the side of the box we have some screenshots from the game artwork. A few of these were launch titles and other ones hadn't even come out yet by the time this thing hit the shelves, so they would have been pre-release artwork. We also have a list of games coming soon, and a few of these never actually came out at all, and at least one of them had a different name by the time it was launched, so that's kind of interesting. On the end of the box, we have the technical specifications, and these are all the things that we've already talked about. One thing I thought was neat, though, is that it lists the Genesis 68000 CPU Z80 and VDP as part of the co-processing solution for the 32X. I'm not sure that the Z80 was used at all because that was only for Master System backwards compatibility, I think, and the Master System power-based converter does not work in conjunction with the 32X, so this might be a little bit optimistic marketing here. Here on the back, we find some marketing material. Once again, they're talking about how it's 40 times faster than 16-bit, and they also lean into the number of colors here and here, along with the 50,000 polygons per second and enhanced scaling and rotation. This is sort of misleading as the system does not have hardware-based scaling and rotation. It's all done in software. They do talk about the multi-dimensional 3D stereo sound of Q-Sound, which wasn't really used by many developers, and they talk about a complete range of games, which we know, of course, there weren't that many at launch. And we also can see that they say that it plays all of your 16-bit Genesis and Sega CD games, which of course you don't need this to play, so that really isn't a selling point. I'm not sure why they bothered to put that there. One final thing is that there's this sticker here on the bottom that says the Genesis 32X is compatible with all Genesis units except the CDX. So this is sort of a late-breaking issue that they found that it is not compatible, even though the manual says that it is. So they have the sticker covering up the compatibility statement on the box with an amended, revised sticker. All right, time to get this thing opened up and see what we're dealing with here. All right, looks like we've got some paperwork here. We'll check that out in a second. We've got the original console right here. Looks like Steve kept everything just as it originally came, which is quite unusual. So nice work, Steve. We've got an RF modulator here. We won't be using that. Some kind of adapter. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Composite AV cable. Looks like we've got a couple adapter cables here. We've got the original power brick and a copy of Doom for the 32X, which was not a pack-in title. This system didn't come with any pack-in titles, so this would have been purchased separately. So here we've got the instruction manual, and it talks about how to connect your 32X to your Genesis or Mega Drive. By the time this thing came out, there were a whole bunch of different models of Genesis and Mega Drive, so the instructions kind of cover each and every permutation of hardware you might have, including connecting to the Genesis CDX, which we saw on the box was not supported. So a little bit of late-breaking news there is that this is not valid information. In fact, the 32X had compatibility issues with a range of hardware, and consumers had problems connecting it to their systems, getting it to work. So a lot of returns and confusion about what worked and what didn't. And we will find that there were some teething issues with the system and compatibility issues with various permutations of Genesis hardware. In fact, here's a little addendum to the manual where it says, do not connect, all in caps, the Genesis 32X to the Genesis CDX. So they've corrected the mistake in the manual here, and they've also mentioned that the Master System Power Base Converter is not compatible with the 32X. Now, because there were no pack-in titles, we got these coupons instead for getting $10 back on various game purchases. Some of these games weren't yet available at the time the system launched, and some of them were. One thing that's interesting here is this one talks about buying Metalhead and getting $10 back. On the box, it called the game Wirehead. I think that name may have changed at some point between the time that the box art was finished and the coupon went into the box. And the final thing of interest in the box is this little cover, which is used on certain models of Mega Drive 2 when the Mega CD expansion is not present. Apparently, the 32X crashes when used with certain models of Mega Drive 2, and this band-aids around the problem by either grounding or terminating some of the pins on the expansion connector, again, when the Mega CD add-on is not present. So just another one of the multitude of compatibility problems the 32X faced at launch time. First, I think we need to talk about the physical design. The original Mega Drive 1 is, in my opinion, not only one of the best looking consoles of its generation, but perhaps one of the best looking consoles of all time. What I have here is actually a European spec Mega Drive, which is the most understated of the regional variants. To me, the US spec model, with its angular Genesis logo and little splash of red, let's call it crimson, looks even better. It's kind of halfway between the Euro version and the Japanese model's red and gold. But for my money, nothing beats the US launch models that also include the high-definition graphics text around the top. Which brings me to the 32X. There's no getting around it. It looks like a mushroom. Everybody knows it. We have the best looking console, and then we have this. Even the Power Base Converter at least attempted to blend in with the Mega Drive's aesthetic, so I don't know what Sega of America were thinking when they came up with this look. Anyway, it installs like a cartridge, or at least it should. Ah, I see the problem. I've got this spacer here, which I believe is for the Mega Drive 2. We don't need that. Let's see. Ah, yes, much better. There we go. The 32X taps into the Mega Drive's address and data buses, clock, and other signals available on the cartridge slot. As an add-on expansion, it can only be used in conjunction with the Mega Drive and not as a standalone device. Next, we have to connect the AV pass-through cable from the Mega Drive to the 32X. As this is a Model 1, it only has the full-size DIN connector, so we need an adapter. Also, the Model 1 doesn't have stereo audio on the AV port, so I'd need a custom cable that would pick up stereo from the front headphone jack if I wanted that. The pass-through cable channels RGB video, composite sync, and audio from the Mega Drive to a video mixer chip on the 32X. These signals aren't available on the Mega Drive's cartridge slot, which is why we have to use an external cable instead. This setup lets you play your original Mega Drive games with the 32X installed, but also allows 32X specific games to take advantage of the sound and video chips in the base console. And of course, 32X games will not fit inside the Mega Drive itself. The 32X doesn't get its power from the base console, probably because all of the new custom chips require more power than the Mega Drive can supply. Not really that big of a deal, honestly. Now, I could use the included composite AV cable, but I'd much prefer to use RGB SCART. My Model 1 Mega Drive's RGB cable won't fit the 32X, which uses the smaller mini-DIN format, so I purchased this Model 2 cable instead, which should do the job. I should mention that my Mega Drive has the popular triple bypass mod. That means it no longer produces composite video, only clean RGB. I don't think that's going to matter, as the 32X ingests only RGB and has its own video encoder chip that produces the various output signals. Now, I am curious if the 32X will be able to output composite video when playing Mega Drive games with the triple bypass installed. I think we're going to have to try that out. One final thing. I'm going to use this RCA breakout cable with the 1/8 inch jack on the front of the Mega Drive in order to get stereo sound. The 32X audio is passed back through the cartridge slot, so apparently this is the correct way to do it if you have a Model 1. Well, that's a lot of wires and custom cables. No wonder new owners were confused when they tried hooking this up on Christmas morning. I think we are ready to test it out, so let's fire up Doom, which was one of the 3 launch titles in the USA. Huh. Well, that's not what we wanted to see. I guess it's pretty much par for the course with vintage hardware, isn't it? It does appear that the game is running, and the audio works, but the video is all scrambled. Well, I guess it's time to open this thing up and see what's going on the inside. All right, so here we go. This is the entirety of the 32X on these 2 separate PCBs. Here we've got the I/O portion of the system on the large board, and then connected to that we have the processing portion of the system on this small board with these 4 large ASICs, and it's a very compact design. That's interesting. It could be in any footprint it wanted to be. I'm wondering why they chose the design they did. What's interesting too is that the logic board is connected to the I/O board with these 2 ribbon cables, and these are a known point of failure. If you have a 32X that's crashing, has a black screen, or other failures, oftentimes it's just these ribbon cables. So what I did is I had an initial inspection of the board. I checked out the system for any leaking or bulging capacitors, and I didn't see any. But I also tested the capacitors for ESR, and I found that a lot of them are well outside of the spec. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean and reseat these ribbon cables in case that is the problem, and I'm also going to replace the capacitors because this is 1994. This is peak bad capacitor years. So I suspect that's really what we're dealing with here. So let's get that going. As always, I've purchased my parts from Console 5. You've seen me recap plenty of things before, so I'm gonna make this quick. Alright, all the capacitors have been replaced and marked off except for this one here, which is a polymer cap and generally doesn't need to be replaced. This one here has been uprated by the kit in order to address a video stability issue. And over here we have a ceramic capacitor that can optionally be replaced by this little guy here, in order to address another video stability fix, but it's very hard to access this and I'm worried about damaging something else in this area. I don't have a microscope, so I'm not going to replace this unless I absolutely have to. Of all the capacitors that were replaced, only these 3 here tested out good. All the rest of them tested out of spec, mostly with high ESR ratings. So it is a good thing that we replaced them, even if they hadn't really leaked yet. I only smelled the characteristic smell of rotting fish one time removing a capacitor. So they weren't too bad, but it's a good thing we did them. Before I reassemble this, I am going to spray some contact cleaner into the receptacles for the ribbon cables. Now it does say WD-40 here, guys, but this is not WD-40. It is WD-40 branded contact cleaner. And there we go. Ugh, bummer. Well, that didn't fix it. We still got the rolling image, and before anyone asks, it's not because this is a PAL machine either. Generally speaking, an NTSC 32X won't work with a PAL Mega Drive, not because of a region lockout, but because of the Genlock frequency mismatch. My Mega Drive has a region select mod installed, so I can easily switch between PAL and NTSC. So here's what I think is going on. Remember when I mentioned the issues that new 32X buyers were having that resulted in confusion and product returns? Despite its short commercial life, Sega released numerous service bulletins designed to address compatibility issues that caused screen shaking, sound slowdowns, lockups, and more. Several of these bulletins were specific to the Model 1 PAL Mega Drive with the VA4 revision board, which, as it turns out, is exactly the one that I have here. Most of these service bulletins center around improving the clock signal coming from the console, and while I could make all the required changes, my system's already a rat's nest of wires and multiple mod chips, which I'd have to remove in order to gain access to the board. I could do that, but I'm not excited about the prospect. It's also worth noting that there are service bulletins for other models of Mega Drive as well, so if you have problems with your new 32X, you might want to look into them. Before we troubleshoot any further, I want to rule out my VA4 system as the source of the problem, so let's try the 32X with this Model 2 Genesis instead. Aha! And there we go. Works like a charm, with fewer cables and adapters too. The Model 2 just doesn't have the looks of the original, nor the sound quality, but at least it's working now. We'll come back to Doom in a little bit because there's an enhanced homebrew version that improves just about everything that we absolutely have to take a look at. But first, let's have a look at some of the other games in the library and do a few comparisons. First up is Virtua Racing Deluxe, one of the 3 launch titles.
Virtua Racing!
Many 32X games were basically reskins of existing Genesis titles, and this one is no different. Still, let's try and imagine what firing this up on Christmas morning 1994 might have felt like. The Genesis version is the only game to make use of the custom Sega Virtual Processor chip built into the cartridge, so it's not the best example to use when comparing the capabilities of the systems. Both systems have fast, smooth gameplay, but the polygon count, shading, and sound on the 32X are markedly improved. Even the 32X version can't escape the low draw distances and pop-in that all early 3D game systems suffered from. Still, for a launch title, Virtua Racing Deluxe makes a great first impression and remains to this day one of the best rated games for the system. Next up, we've got Afterburner 2. It's not my favorite of the Sega Superscaler games, and I'm rubbish at it, but here we go. Neither the 32X nor the Genesis have any hardware sprite scaling or rotation, so these types of games have to rely on clever programming and raw CPU power. That makes the fact that this version is close to arcade perfect all the more impressive. It may only run at 30 frames per second instead of 60, but it's responsive enough that your average gamer, like me, isn't going to notice or care. The difference between the two systems is far more noticeable here than what we saw with Virtua Racing. Afterburner 2 makes a compelling case for the 32X hardware, but we'll also have to compare it to the Saturn, which we'll do shortly, in order to get the full picture.
Round 2, fight.
Despite the small library, there were a handful of heavy hitters, and MK2 was indeed huge when it landed in the arcades back in November of '93. What we have here is another reskinned Genesis port. Heck, it still uses the base console to render the backgrounds, while the 32X handles the more colorful character sprites and shadows. Sound effects and speech samples have been improved, but the Genesis soundtrack remains unchanged.
Finish him. Sub-Zero wins. Fatality. Fight.
The Genesis version was already quite competent, and while the 32X brings the game even closer to the arcade, I have to wonder if it was enough to justify the cost of the add-on. Speaking of fighters, there are a surprising number of also-rans on the platform. There sure were a lot of attempts to cash in on the formula at that point in history. Absent are any Street Fighter games, although one had been in development but was cancelled. Okay, time to move on to a game that wasn't just a copycat, and actually pushed the boundaries of the fighting genre.
Fight! 1, ready, go!
This is Virtua Fighter, one of the killer apps for the 32X platform. Designed by Suzuki Yu of Outrun fame, it was an important milestone in the evolution of fighting games, as it was the first to move into the third dimension. It was also a good example of what the 32X was capable of. Now, let's compare the Saturn version, which was a launch title for the console. With its SH2 CPUs running 5 MHz faster, the Saturn also had 8 times the RAM and 6 times the video memory. Unlike the 32X, it also had 2 dedicated video display processors to offload tasks from the CPU, such as sprite rendering, geometric transformations, background rotation and scaling, and 3D shading and texture mapping. You can see how much more detail there is in the characters and the fighting ring, not to mention the soundtrack.
Fight! 1, ready, go!
The difference is apparent, but both games look and play well enough. It's pretty clear that Sega didn't need 2 32-bit consoles competing against each other in the same launch year. That's not even the whole story though, because the Saturn was capable of much more. A year later, Virtua Fighter Remix was released. It had drastically improved graphics from the original, and while it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, it does illustrate the difference the Saturn's 2 video processors made.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
One of my favorite superscalar games is Space Harrier. Like Afterburner 2, it looks great on the 32X, but let's be honest, these games were almost 10 years old by the time they were ported to the system, so it shouldn't be that surprising. Like Afterburner 2, the Saturn version runs at a higher frame rate, but otherwise there's just not that much in it. The 32X version is close to arcade perfect. It just suffers from the occasional slowdown when there are too many sprites on screen at once. I'd have been very happy with this one back in the day.
You're doing great.
Star Wars Arcade is the second launch title we'll look at today. When the 32X came to market, the hardware was of an all-new design and more complex than systems of the past. Developers were already rushing to get their first titles ready and hadn't had time to gain a full understanding of the architecture. The end result is that many of the early games didn't use the full capability of the new hardware. Some developers also had to cut features to make the launch deadline, or because they hadn't yet learned to wring the most out of the system.
Storm the Imperial Death Star and wipe out enemy fighters.
Lock S files and attack positions.
3 leaders standing by. They're coming in. 3 marks at 210. Watch it, you've got one on his tail.
Star Wars is one such pared-down release. Polygon counts are lower than the arcade original, as is the frame rate, which sometimes dips below 20. Level of detail is lower throughout, including missing asteroids in the first stage. It's possible that given more development time, these issues could have been overcome, but the lack of dedicated 3D hardware certainly didn't help. Regardless, I still think the game is a pretty impressive effort for 1994. It's just easy to get bogged down in the technical details and forget to enjoy the game for what it is instead of what it isn't. Here's an interesting game that's totally unique to the 32X. Colibri, I hope I'm saying that right, has been affectionately called Echo the Hummingbird for its exploration and puzzle-solving based gameplay. It also reminds me a bit of Apidia on the Amiga, which is itself a gorgeous insect-based shooter, minus the puzzle elements. With 4 levels of parallax, the artwork in the foreground planes really takes advantage of the system's rich color palette, while the Mega Drive's VDP appears to be used to render the background layers. The game is a refreshing change from all the arcade ports and Genesis reskins. It was well received too, scoring high marks from a number of magazines and reviewers. Of the games that were released, a good number were sports titles, including NFL, FIFA, golf, baseball, and boxing. While we won't be seeing any of those in this review, I'll happily make an exception for NBA Jam, which is a welcome addition to any platform.
Slam it! Intercepted!
Okay, we've seen a selection from the library of commercial releases, but how about homebrew? As you might imagine, the 32X is a bit of a neglected platform when it comes to that as well. There are well-made ports of Rick Dangerous and Wolfenstein 3D, along with a few other original games and demos, but this one is particularly impressive. What you're seeing is OpenLara, an open-source Tomb Raider engine that was ported to the 32X a few years ago. It's still very much a work in progress and only runs on a single SH2 processor at the moment, but recent commits to the project's GitHub show that incremental updates are still being made. Pretty impressive stuff considering the game's original minimum requirements were a Pentium PC with 8 MB of RAM, and the 32X has to make do with just 256K. Okay, the 2 MB cartridge ROM makes up for some of the deficit, but still. And that brings us back to where we started, with Doom, the final launch title for the system. If you've been living under a rock, Doom was one of the most important games of the era, and any system that was able to run it in some capacity was made to, along with some that probably shouldn't have been. What we have here is a classic example of a rushed job. Many sacrifices were made in order to have the game ready for the system's launch. All of the levels from Episode 3 have been omitted, as have several enemies, objects, and textures. Further, the game only runs at around 15 to 20 frames per second. Enemies weren't programmed to fight each other like in the original, and what's more, only have front-facing sprites, which means the player can sneak up behind one even though it looks like the enemy is staring right at you. Remember what I said earlier about developers not having enough time to fully understand the new hardware, so they were unable to take full advantage of it? Well, now the time has come to see what the game could have looked like had it been given proper care, attention, and, most importantly, time. This is Doom 32X Resurrection, and it's by far the most impressive homebrew title for the platform. It completely replaces the original game's engine and adds a slew of performance improvements as well as the missing levels, enemies, lighting effects, sprite rotation, and more. It even features split-screen co-op and deathmatch, plus network play via link cable. Ah yes, the classic screen melting effect is back thanks to some clever programming that uses the Mega Drive 68000 CPU along with its RAM and VRAM for temporary storage. Did you hear the difference in sound quality as well? Give a listen to the official release once more. Resurrection even has a custom sound driver that can use the Sega CD hardware, if available, to offload sound mixing, which frees up CPU time and gives the game an additional performance boost. In that configuration, all 5 CPUs in the Tower of Power are being used simultaneously by the game. So there we have it, the most impressive piece of software ever made for the Sega 32X. Will anyone be able to follow this up with a second act? Only time will tell, but I remain ever hopeful. Before we wrap up, I thought I should mention the Sega Neptune, an unreleased all-in-one Genesis and 32X console that Sega had planned for the fall of 1995. The project was cancelled on fears it wasn't viable due to cost and the harm it could cause to sales of the Saturn. No doubt Sega had already seen the writing on the wall for the 32X by then as well. Just recently, a Brazilian company called GamesCare announced the GF1 Neptune, an FPGA-based reimagining of Sega's unreleased console. At this time, no confirmed date or price has been published, but news continues to trickle out. In the meantime, you can scratch your FPGA itch with the 32X core on the Mister, which works great and is available right now, although you won't be able to use your original game cartridges with it. Probably not an issue for most. In an unrelated project, ex-user Kosam the Great is working on a replica Neptune PCB that you can build and populate using chips from a donor Mega Drive and 32X. Triple bypass and region select mods are built in, and the unit is compatible with a real Mega CD as well. To pair with it, check out this brand new Neptune case that's been created by ex-user dvisix. It can house the Kosam Neptune, a regular Genesis, or a Genesis and 32X that have been combined into a single unit using the Longhorn modification. With all this recent interest in the platform, perhaps new game development will be revitalized as well. I guess only time will tell. Before reassembling the console, I gave it a proper cleaning and took a moment to reflect. And you know what? I think the 32X has really started growing on me, as has the Model 2. The system has a reputation, and I get it. By the time it arrived, far more advanced consoles were not just on the horizon, but practically within reach. But having played almost every game in the library, I still found the 32X to be a competent upgrade with a lot of its potential left untapped. While we wouldn't think twice about slapping an upgrade on our PC, even back in '94, Sega took a risk when they offered players a way to power up their existing game consoles. It didn't pan out for them then, but you have to give them credit for trying something new. Despite being rushed to release, the system was still far too late to make an impact in the marketplace. If it had launched a year or two earlier and all the cancelled titles were actually finished, then maybe the story would have been different. Being plagued by compatibility issues probably didn't improve its chances either. At least, not with us Model 1 VA4 owners anyway. So there we have it. The Sega Genesis 32X. Better than I thought, despite facing an uphill battle from the moment of its inception. Thank you once again to Steve for trusting me with your childhood Christmas present. Your generosity is very much appreciated. I hope you enjoyed this bit. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Retro Bits.